Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whenever you discover this discussion with the David Enrich, the business investigations editor for the New York Times, and I'm so incredibly happy to be discussing really what's on a lot of people's minds this morning. But before we do so, I want to do a slight introduction. If you're not aware of who David Enrich is, he has been a prolific writer, uh, providing some of the most important detailed analysis of really the power structure of this country and quite frankly the world as far as I'm concerned, starting with Dark Towers that was released in 2020, the story of Deutsche Bank, and of course the relationship with Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. Shortly after that, he released Servants of the Damned, an introspection into how some of the tall building law firms of the United States have operated to really, I think, play roulette with our democracy. And most recently, his latest release is Murder the Truth, which is the story of libel and how billionaires can maneuver to basically attack freedom of speech and so forth. But the reason we're discussing this morning with David, and I'm sure he's got a lot going on, is in the aftermath of an article that landed about a month ago on the front page of the New York Times that for those of us who have been paying attention for a while, we're wondering, wow, that finally came. And it was a very interesting idea given really the total story of Jeffrey Epstein in context to the Epstein files. And the article is called How JP Morgan Enabled the Crimes of Jeffrey Epstein. And of course, there's more to come as we move forward. But I think I want to start off the dialogue, David, to understand how you and your colleagues, Matthew Goldstein and Jessica Silver Greenberg, after going through approximately 13,000 documents researching this article, that you started to ask some questions that hadn't seeped into mainstream media throughout the entirety of this time. I wonder if you could kind of give just an overview first of the development of this revelation.
Well, and obviously, there's been an enormous amount written about Jeffrey Epstein over the past 5 or 10 years. And a lot of that, in fact, has focused not just on Epstein's many crimes, but also on the powerful people and powerful institutions that were surrounding him and at times helping him commit those crimes, or at least turning a blind eye as he committed them. And it kind of occurred to me that there has been a ton written about all of these different institutions and individuals who have helped him, but there has not been a whole lot of effort by the mainstream media, including by us at the New York Times, to really kind of step back a little bit and assess the totality of this. There's been lots of incremental, kind of little bit by bit developments that are very hard for normal people. Frankly, they're hard for me as well to keep track of, even when I'm in the midst of writing out some of those pieces. And so we really thought that it would make sense to just kind of step back and pick one of the biggest, most important institutions that's been in the middle of this, JP Morgan, which to most people who have been following this stuff just, as passive observers and occasional readers, like JP Morgan, I don't think really registered as a primary player in the Epstein saga, even though depending on your perspective, you could argue, I think plausibly, that it was one of the most important players. And so we just started, again, a lot's been written about JP Morgan. There's a lot that's been in the public domain, just the court records and things like that. And we just started by reading everything that was in the public domain. And that meant going through, various federal court dockets and just reading every single exhibit carefully and kind of tracking it, putting it in a big spreadsheet, creating a timeline, and just kind of connecting all these little jigsaw puzzle pieces together. And then on top of that, we also got access to some depositions that various JP Morgan executives and bankers had given under oath that had never become public. And the combination of those two things, kind of looking at the entirety of the public record that has not been very clearly mined by journalists yet, and these new documents that we got, and with interviews with some of the people involved, we were able to put together, I think, probably the first time there's been a really comprehensive picture of how, the biggest bank in the US and arguably one of the most prestigious banks in the world played this pretty important role enabling Epstein. And the crux of the revelation is that the bank, top executives of the bank knew that or had very good reason to believe that Epstein was running a sex trafficking operation and that their bank was playing a role in that. And they made a conscious decision to keep doing business with him, despite the warnings of a bunch of people kind of up and down the hierarchy, ranging from kind of mid-level compliance officers and anti-money laundering specialists up to some very senior executives who are, including the bank's general counsel, who argued on numerous occasions that JP Morgan should stop doing business with this guy. And they were every single time overruled by their superiors. And up until 2013, when the bank finally made a decision to cut ties with Epstein. But by then, and they had spent the past 15 years or so providing absolutely essential financial services to Epstein so that he could move his money, so that he could pay women and girls, so that he could work with other institutions to kind of bring more money in and bring more women and girls into the country. And so the bank ended up playing a very crucial, pivotal role in this long-running scandal. And I don't think that had become I think the role that we played in the story was really to kind of connect all of these dots and form this more or less complete jigsaw puzzle that had never really been put together before.
Well, I guess the first question that I have is thank you for doing that. But at the same time, I'm kind of like left a little staggered going, why didn't the Times find it worthwhile then?
I don't think it's, I don't, I wouldn't, I kind of would take issue with the premise of that question. And look, we have spent my colleagues and I, and some of my colleagues more than me. I've been kind of in and out of this story over the past 6 years. I've always been fascinated by it, but I've been pulled in a bunch of different directions.
Sure.
But a couple of my colleagues have been more or less devoted to this full time, and I think they've presented huge amounts of information to the public that never would have become public. But it's just kind of hard in the heat of the moment and chasing these incremental developments and staying on top of a story. It sometimes you lose the forest for the trees a little bit, and so we had written a lot, and so had some other news organizations like the Wall Street Journal. We had all written a lot about the individual things that had happened with individual JP Morgan executives and on some individual occasions. And we'd written those stories as far back as 2019. And again, I'm not just talking about the Times, I'm talking about other news outlets as well.
Sure.
What no one had done with the passage of time is really step back and look at all of the stuff that had piled up in the public record and then kind of gone a step further and tried to get some other stuff that wasn't even in the public record. And one of the things I found in covering and closely observing the Epstein story is that thanks in large part to a lot of really dogged journalists over the years, as well as some dogged lawyers, there is a huge amount of stuff in the public domain that most people are not even aware of. And I
Sure.
mean, I think we've seen in the Trump administration in their efforts to pretend to be transparent about this stuff without actually adding transparency, they've kind of tried to take advantage of the fact that there is in some cases a mismatch between what is already public and what the people who are talking the most about the Epstein scandal realize is public. And sometimes there's a lot more in the public domain. Again, it's buried in the public domain, right? But it is like anyone with a Pacer account who can log into the federal court system or has research skills that can get them into state court systems. It's there for the taking and for the looking. And one of the, I mean, frankly, not to toot my own horn, but one of the pieces of value I think I've added to the Epstein coverage at the Times is that some of my colleagues have been doing this amazing reporting, but they're just a little too close to it. And so they've
Huh.
just lost some perspective. And I think which is, I don't mean that as a criticism. It's just that's like a inevitable outcome when you are immersed in the day-to-day developments of a huge story over a period of years. And so it's helpful sometimes to just kind of step back and say, if I'm talking to my parents or to a neighbor or a friend who has, knows Epstein's a terrible guy, knows there's a bunch of mysteries surrounding him, is wondering like what really was going on, they are obviously not steeped in the incremental minutia that people who have been following this closely are. And so I think that it's one way that journalism, through no fault of anyone's, and just despite the very best of intentions and amazing work that's being done, sometimes we fail readers because we're losing sight of what people know and what people, normal human beings, are able to keep track of. And so that's something we think about a lot and try from a storytelling standpoint and kind of a story framing standpoint to address for the vast majority of readers who can't remember that 4 years ago we wrote like a 800 word story that revealed part of this. You immediately lose sight of that because you're human and do not have a sponge as a brain,
Right.
or at
And
least
it,
I don't.
well, it brings to mind some scary questions about AI too, in the overwhelming information, misinformation that exists out there. But to your point, we rely on the New York Times to be the nation's paper of record to guide us through these storms. And it's so crystal clear to me how incredible it was for you to be in that pole position with the perspective that you said, because it makes sense to be able to step back. Because when you start this article out, I mean, you go back to 2011, and Epstein is having a meeting where he goes to the executive suites in the obviously one of the most prestigious banks on the planet. This after, obviously a lot of red flags that were going on. And he had actually been under house arrest for 13 months prior to this actual meeting. But he was whisked to the top floor where obviously Jamie Dimon and the rest of the executive senior leadership had offices. He also had over 200, well, at that time, I may maybe be confused, but he had a lot of money at the bank and a lot of impact, obviously. So,
Yep.
what happened at that moment that set the stage for how you unwound this story?
Well, we picked that moment just because it just struck me as such a stunning thing to behold that you have this guy, Jeffrey Epstein, who at that point he spent 13 months in jail. He spent a year under house arrest for soliciting prostitution from a minor. There has been just huge amounts of information in the public domain. Like, and I don't mean like buried in court files. I mean like front page articles in the New York Post and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal about what a sleazebag this guy is. And yet here he is riding the executive elevator car up to one of the top floors where he is going to be in, shouting distance of Jamie Dimon, who is kind of the king of Wall Street. And he's there not to meet Dimon, but to meet Stephen Cutler, who is the bank's general counsel at the time. And Cutler was one of the people who had developed really severe misgivings about Epstein, in large part because, the bank was doing a huge amount of business with someone who had been convicted of a crime, was a level 3 registered sex offender, which is the worst kind of sex offender in New York. It means basically that there's a very good likelihood that you will commit crimes again and are going to, continue to be committing sex crimes. And so that is, from Cutler's standpoint, this was not the kind of guy the bank should be doing business with. He had had some run-ins with Epstein, professional run-ins with Epstein in the past that had gone very badly. And so Cutler, at this point in 2011, was one of the people leading the charge to kick Epstein out. So he meets with Epstein. Epstein, does his Epstein thing, which is basically make the point that, look, yes, I served jail time. It was kind of a mix up, basically. I didn't realize the prostitute was underage. And look at all these other famous, rich, powerful people that continue to work with me. And if people like Bill Gates and Ehud Barak, the former Israeli prime minister, and people like Leon Black, the private equity kingpin, if people like that are continuing to do business with me, like obviously I'm fine. And why should JP Morgan like hesitate? And Cutler's reaction to this after meeting with him during that meeting and then a subsequent encounter that they had, he basically decided that despite what Epstein was saying, the reputational risk of continuing to do business with him was so great that he still thought the bank should cut ties. And you might think, as a normal observer of business and things happening in the world, that the general counsel of a bank says, no, we've got to get rid of this guy, then the bank would actually get rid of him. That's not what happened. This was one of the final times where a top JP Morgan executive, in this case, Cutler, recommended or strongly urged the bank to cut ties with Epstein and was overruled by executives further up the food chain the public explanation was basically that he was a lucrative client. He deserved a second chance. He had served his time in jail. And so they kept doing business with him for another 2 years or so. And even by the time Cutler met Epstein in 2011, already on, I think, 4 other occasions, it might be 3 other occasions, I can't remember, on 3 or 4 other occasions leading up to that, the bank had already gone through this process repeatedly, where executives in the compliance division, in the anti-money laundering division, in the private banking division, they had all developed concerns and expressed their qualms loudly internally and tried to get rid of Epstein. And each time the same thing happened, which was that executives higher up the food chain who had tight personal relationships with Epstein went to bat for him and prevailed. So it's it was a very, very clear pattern of making a conscious decision in the face of concerns to essentially look the other way and continue doing business with someone who is a very profitable client.
Well, to just emphasize what you said, that when you're the general counsel of a, first of all, you're the top legal supervisor in the entire corporate legal division at the world's largest bank. And obviously, Cutler was I believe he was a regulator at the
Yeah.
SEC, but right. And
Yeah,
so
he'd been
this
the head
guy
of enforcement at the SEC prior to arriving at JP Morgan. So he is not,
had
this is no shrinking violet.
exactly, and his entire sort of purpose is to protect JP Morgan from any sort of lawsuits or any sorts of hemorrhaging of any scandalous scenarios or just anything by way of criminal or things that are going to just cost the bank a lot of money and reputational
Yeah.
situations and so forth. So he takes this though then to Jess Staley, correct? Jess Staley, I believe,
Yep.
arranged the meeting. Can you tell us who Jess Staley is?
Yeah, so Staley was one of the top ranking executives at JP Morgan. He initially ran the private banking division, which caters to like the richest of the rich. He then was promoted to run the entire wealth management division at JP Morgan, which includes the private bank, but it includes kind of their brokerage business and the ways they manage money for very rich people, but who are not quite as rich as the private banking clients. And then after that, he got promoted again to run the whole investment bank at JP Morgan. So this is one of, and he was considered probably the most likely successor to Jamie Dimon as CEO of the entire company. So Staley is one of the most kind of senior, most experienced people on all of Wall Street. And starting in the late 1990s, while he was at JP Morgan, he had begun to develop a relationship with Epstein. And, the exact contours of this relationship and the timeline of this relationship remain a little bit unclear. But what is quite clear is that over the, 15 years or so that that Staley and Epstein were friends while Staley was a top executive at JP Morgan, the relationship went from being strictly professional to being a lot more than that. And so Staley would, at times, he was not only visiting Epstein at his home in New York, when Epstein was in jail, he went down to visit him in Florida. At various points, Staley went to some of Epstein's properties and stayed at those properties, even when Epstein wasn't there. We have a scene in the story about Staley writing him an email while Staley is in the hot tub drinking wine in in Epstein's ranch in New Mexico, which incidentally was the site of a lot of his alleged sex crimes. And in at least one occasion that we identified, and Staley meets a young woman at Epstein's house and ends up having sex with her. And there is no allegation that we have reported that indicates that this was anything other than a consensual relationship. But I will say that the woman with whom he had sex has accused Epstein in court of not only sexually abusing her, but also farming her out to some of Epstein's friends to have what she viewed as coercive sex. And now, just to be clear, that woman has not specifically and publicly pointed the finger at Staley, but this is someone who has accused Epstein of essentially sex trafficking her. And there's no dispute that Staley at one point did have sex with her after having met her in Epstein's house. And again, this is a time period. This encounter happened years after Epstein had first been accused of sexual misconduct and then been convicted and spent time in jail. So and that's something that about which Staley had clear awareness. And so Staley, doing this stuff in his personal time is also in work hours pushing over and over again to keep doing business for JP Morgan to keep doing business with Epstein. And part of the reason he was so successful in making that point is that it was a very lucrative relationship for JP Morgan. And Epstein was in introducing JP Morgan executives, including but not limited to Staley, to a lot of rich and powerful people who had the potential to become JP Morgan clients themselves. He kind of served as a middleman on some big corporate transactions that JP Morgan did that generated in millions, if not billions of dollars in revenue for the bank. And so the bank I wouldn't say the bank was reliant on Epstein because it's a huge financial institution, but there's no doubt that he was a really important customer of the bank at various points. And for that, at least in part for that reason, Staley was a very forceful advocate of keeping him in good standing at JP Morgan.
Right. And so to recap, just kind of the nature of who Jess Staley is, he was being he was about to take over the reins as chairman of JP Morgan Chase. It's probably important to remind people at this time, it was 2008 when all of this is happening. There was also the great financial crisis meltdown that was taking shape. Just out of curiosity, do you think that uh, had some influence in terms of how things were being dealt with operationally? Because I never saw any of that indicated in any of your writings, but I was just curious, just from a
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, I think clearly, and as you know, and as I know, 2008 was an absolutely insane period in the banking industry, and there were crimes that were being committed. There was very rich people running around to salvage their investments. There were senior executives up and down Wall Street racing to kind of save their companies, and there were a lot of, I mean, deals that were done and kind of conventions that were shoved aside as people were in this frenzy. And look, the crisis happened at a time when Epstein was in jail. And yet you can see that executives like Staley, but not just Staley, other Wall Street executives and other JP Morgan executives, while Epstein is in jail in Florida, they are in touch with him, emailing him, meeting with him, trying to get his advice on how to kind of weather this crisis. And there's one moment in the story where we mention that, and this is, the financial crisis is happening, and then the Madoff Ponzi scheme erupts, and JP Morgan was right in the middle of that scandal too, by the way, having done a lot of banking with Madoff over the years. And at one point, Jess Staley and one of his colleagues, Mary Erdos, are talking about how to deal with this Madoff crisis that is, just exploding in front of them. And they reach out to Epstein for advice and kind of as a sounding board. So I think, and I guess to answer your question, I'm not sure that it really like operationally changed things, but there's no question. Look, one of Epstein's greatest gifts, I think, was an ability to kind of insinuate himself into a lot of situations, and partly as a result of that, he had this like super thick Rolodex of contacts all over the world and in all walks of life, and he was able to use those connections that he had to kind of buy favor with his other connections. And so he built this network in part by kind of trading favors with people. And so during the financial crisis, that was a time when everyone was running around with their like chickens with their head cut off, trying to like figure out who to talk to about this and that. And so Epstein, with all of these connections and the ability to get so many people on the phone, even from his jail cell in Florida, he was doing his matchmaking thing and kind of playing the central role, which, is doesn't do him a whole lot of good while he's incarcerated, but it means that he has become increasingly indispensable to a wider and wider range of people who he now has the capacity to go to them and remind them of the favors he did for them at this point, and maybe call in some of those favors at some point in the future.
Well, as your article reveals, that Epstein wasn't an executive at the bank. He was a client, but he had
Yep.
a lot of substantial money and the client relationships and so forth. And that I'd like to maybe have you parse further what that means. But there was over $1 billion in transactions over a 10-year period. Can you please unpack that?
Yeah, and this became public after the fact, because JP Morgan, and one of the huge bright red flags that the bank missed over and over again was the fact that Epstein was using the bank to conduct all sorts of transactions that normally would have been considered very suspicious. And so, I mean, that ranged from, he was setting up bank accounts at the bank for some of his victims, and without the victims actually being there, physically present, uh, to, have the bank account open for them, which is a complete violation of the way things are supposed to work in banking, in part because you don't want people setting up accounts for people if they're not there, because that maybe they're not who they say they are. Maybe they're victims of human trafficking, which in this case happened to be the case. He's doing transactions all over the world. He's wiring money to banks in places like Russia and Belarus. He is sending money to women in various parts of the world, including in places in Eastern Europe that have historically been hubs for sex trafficking. And it is just a huge amount of money, and it's often I think the total number was over $1 billion over a period of years, and only after the fact, after Epstein not only had been kicked out of the bank in 2013, but after Epstein had subsequently been arrested, criminally charged, and then died in jail. In jail, it was only then, after that, this all blew up in the public spotlight, that JP Morgan went back through its paperwork and the transactions and said, a lot of that actually was pretty suspicious. By law, banks are required, when they notice suspicious activity, to report that to federal regulators in the form of what's known as a suspicious activity report, which is basically meant to give regulators a heads up when there might be financial crimes being committed using the global financial system. And the idea is that regulators, when alerted to potentially suspicious transactions, have the ability to go look into that a little bit more and see, what is that money actually being used for? Is there a crime that's in process? Should we be investigating? JP Morgan didn't do any of that in real time. What it did after Epstein's death in 2019 is it went back through all these transactions and said, oops, we should have done it then, so we're going to do it now. And so they belatedly submitted kind of a whole stack of suspicious activity reports, which essentially served, it was really kind of like a giant ass covering operation for JP Morgan. It enabled them potentially to tell regulators or lawyers, yes, we have acknowledged this. Yes, we have filed the report. It obviously did nothing whatsoever to potentially help the government, deal with these crimes as they were being committed years earlier. So yeah, and what it revealed, we don't have full transparency yet into what the actual kind of in granular detail about what all these transactions were. What we know is, in kind of broad strokes, the categories they fit into, and a huge amount of them went to countries in Eastern Europe that have been historically been hubs for sex trafficking, but they've also been hubs for other sorts of illegal operations, not necessarily connected to Epstein, but these countries are regular venues for very sophisticated money laundering operations, arms dealing, things like that. And again, we do not have any evidence that that is what Epstein was using these transactions for, but it's definitely not outside the realm of possibility that some of these transactions, we're naturally, I think, assuming that the bulk of this was to finance his acquisition and importation of women and girls. And I think that's probably a pretty good assumption, but it is an assumption, and it's possible it was being used for a wider array of services or products.
Well, like you guys mentioned in the article, however, that there was decades of this sort of money laundering and the shadow economy that's involved with all of these elements that you mentioned, and probably much more, including, I thought it was interesting that you guys said genocide, previous genocides, but in terms of
Yeah.
moving big, caches of money through financial systems and through the entire financial system, of course, not just JP Morgan Chase, but it's really fascinating to hear you lay that out when you consider that, okay, Cutler comes from the SEC, he's general counsel, he's there during this time, but, when this pivotal meeting shapes up with Staley calling for it, I'm curious how much Cutler would have known that at that time, or had access to, or even inquired. I'm curious, does any of your work
Yeah.
lend itself to
Yeah, I mean,
that
it's a
answer?
good question. So, I mean, what Cutler would say and what he has said is that he was not. So when he called for this meeting and when he then pushed to get rid of Epstein as a client, he was fully aware of his conviction for soliciting prostitution from a minor. He was aware that there had been reports in the media that Epstein was kind of snared in this federal investigation into sex trafficking. Uh, but that he claims, and I do not have evidence that directly refutes this. He claims that Cutler was not aware that people within the bank had previously raised concerns that Epstein was using the bank for illegal purposes. So, from his perspective, what he has said publicly, or not publicly, what he said in a deposition that we've seen, is that basically his concerns around Epstein were not legal concerns, they were reputational concerns. And so basically he would say that if my job as general counsel is to police against legal concerns. If my concern is purely reputational, I can give advice and say, I think you should get rid of this guy as a client, but he doesn't have veto power, basically. Whereas if he perceived this as a legal problem for the bank, he would have veto power. Now, that is what Cutler says. I personally have a little trouble believing that, to be honest with you, because first of all, there's a rich trove of written records inside the bank that are now public through court proceedings that show that there were people very loudly complaining for many years about exactly these types of concerns. And I find it a little hard to believe that given the well-documented nature of those concerns that have been raised repeatedly, that Cutler, as general counsel, that none of that had been escalated to him, given that he was talking to the same people, some of the same people that were raising those concerns in the first place. And it seems much more likely to me, although again, I don't have evidence of this, like hard, clear evidence. But my suspicion here is that Cutler really, if he had wanted to go to the mat on this, he could have made such a stink. He could have gone to Jamie Dimon. He could have said, "Look, this is crazy. We're doing business with a guy who's an admitted sex criminal. What are we doing here? We need to stop." And instead, what he did was he kind of very finely sliced his amount of responsibility in a way that allowed him to say, well, technically, this isn't a legal concern, so I don't have to go to the mat, and I can just make a suggestion, even knowing full well that my suggestion will be overruled. I have accomplished what I am technically responsible for, and I will leave it at that. And, based on my experience covering and writing about big global financial institutions that often find themselves in trouble, this is a pretty common pattern, right? People who are aware of potential wrongdoing inside their companies do not say, I am going to go fight this tooth and nail because this is the wrong thing to be doing. Instead, they look for ways to narrowly fulfill the obligations of their job and in a way that allows them to essentially, without literally doing this, but essentially look the other way while bad things are happening because they perceive it as in the best interests of some combination of themselves because it sucks to get in a fight and it sucks to use your political capital to fight against something. And that's not a good career move often. And it also might not be in the best interest, the short-term best interests of your institution, because the Epstein example is very illustrative in that point, because the bank was making a lot of money from Jeffrey Epstein, and so if you have the general counsel demanding we get rid of this guy as a client, that not only costs you money that you're receiving in fees from Jeffrey Epstein, but it also potentially cuts you off from, or at least reduces your flow of business from other people that Epstein is working with, like Leon Black, who was a huge source of revenue for the bank. And so there are these very strong financial incentives, institutionally and individually, within the bank to just find a way to look the other way without literally looking the other way. So again, in Cutler, I do not have evidence that that is exactly what was in Cutler's mind at the time. Do not have that special power, but it is very hard for me to believe that Cutler, given his expertise, his intelligence, his experience, really was completely in the dark about these very serious legal concerns that his colleagues were raising.
Wow, it's just so refreshing to hear you lay that out the way you did. Thank you. I was reminded of a conversation I have on a weekly basis, but I record on Friday with a group of former prosecutors from the DOJ, and one is one of the top white collar. In fact, he sat at the apex of the white collar investigations for Department of Justice White Collar Fraud Division and investigations for decades. I mean, this guy was in charge of the government's case against La Cosa Nostra, not to mention, of course, all things Enron, later WorldCom, and so forth. And what he said to us on Friday, which I find interesting based on what you just said, because further to that, we know that, I think 5 years ago, the ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, did a fantastic feature on the FinCEN files, where there were
Yeah.
millions of suspicions activity reports fostered to the Department of Justice. But what he said revealing what happens at the Department of Justice is, one, they're not as big as the entire financial system, but two, it's kind of a way, and just this is a sidebar, but a way for the banks to kind of wash their hands of it, right? It's like,
Mm,
okay, we gave you guys the information, now it's
right.
up to you, right? So there's that
Yeah,
in
I mean,
terms.
and functionally that's true, right? Because the federal government has a very poor record of actually policing these crimes, even when they are alerted to them or to the potential of them by the financial institutions. I still I get kind of irritated though when I hear people in the banking industry using that as an excuse because the truth is, it's not. Yes, they are using. Sometimes this does give them cover the ass potential. They can keep doing business with the shady person if they've filed the suspicious activity report. On the other hand, like when you see an institution not filing the suspicious activity report, that is definitely like a, a you're breaking the law, you know, and the law might not be super effective and might bury federal regulators in paperwork and false leads, but it's still the law. And so anyway, that's
Well,
yeah,
the former, getting back to the subject, the former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, had mentioned that, Jeffrey Epstein is a collector of people. Still, at this time, people don't really know the full scope, at least the way it's been revealed so far. But we have tons of public information to suggest that red flags were everywhere, of course, for a very long time. But the nature of that moment in October of 2008, when Staley requests the meeting, I believe that Epstein, per your reporting, had said to had said, look, to kind of not just own up to what he had done and what was public and that sort of thing, but he's like, if you want to understand further my credibility, just ask Bill Gates. There was a
yep,
laundry list of clients at that level. I mean, boy, what a name to drop, right? And in addition to him, it wasn't just him, it was Sergey Brin that you guys had prefaced
yep.
in this article. Can you kind of take me through those two kind of entry points, as well as what the volume of money was that was entailed with those particular folks, as well as some other international figures that were obviously some
Yeah.
of the wealthiest, most powerful people on the planet?
Well, it varies from person to person. Our understanding is Sergey Brin was brought in. He was brought in as a JP Morgan client, as more or less a direct result of Epstein introducing him to Jess Staley back in the early aughts, uh, and Brin, who is the co-founder of Google and is worth a huge amount of money. This was around the time that Google was doing its IPO, and so Brin was going from being a really rich dude on paper to being virtually overnight, one of the world's biggest billionaires, and so winning his business. An interesting side note here is that there had been a huge battle among big Wall Street firms who were trying to win the business of doing the Google IPO. And JP Morgan, they weren't completely left out of it, but they were not one of the banks that got the biggest, most lucrative, prestigious assignments there. And so the way these things usually work on Wall Street is that the bank that wins the investment banking assignment is also going to win the wealth management assignment. So in other words, the Brin, after having picked, I can't remember which bank led this, but let's say Goldman Sachs to lead the IPO of Google, would presumably bring most of or much of his wealth to Goldman Sachs to manage, and that's a huge business for Goldman because these rich people pay just enormous amounts of money, amounts in fees, and they deposit huge amounts at the bank, which is very profitable. Anyway, Epstein introduced Brin to Staley. Staley, along with some of his colleagues at the bank, convinced Brin to become a JP Morgan wealth management client, a client of the private bank, in fact. And Brin ended up parking something like $4 billion at JP Morgan, which I don't know exactly what that generated in fee income for JP Morgan, but it was certainly millions and millions of dollars. And it was also very prestigious to have someone like Sergey Brin at be one of your customers at that time. The situation with and there's a whole laundry list of people that Epstein introduced Staley to, and that Staley then introduced his colleagues to, that had the potential to be very lucrative bank clients. Not all of them did become bank clients, and some of them already were bank clients, so on and so forth. But and you then fast forward 8 or 10 years, and there's the Bill Gates situation, which and so first of all, he did. Epstein brokered kind of introductions with Staley and with other JP Morgan executives to Bill Gates. Now, of course, a bank like JP Morgan has every interest in already knowing Bill Gates. And in fact, it was not like this was the first time someone like Staley had met Gates. But what Epstein did, and again, this is kind of his specialty, is that he helped kind of create a transaction that he hoped would bring Gates and his foundation on the one hand with JP Morgan on the other together. And so a lot of time and energy at both the Gates Foundation and JP Morgan was spent looking into the creation of what was going to be an enormous charitable fund. This ended up never getting off the ground, but Epstein was the mastermind of this and had negotiated as kind of the person in the middle to potentially collect huge amounts of money in fees for himself as part of this. And so at the moment that Epstein walked into Stephen Cutler's office at JP Morgan and said, "Look, I'm not a bad guy. Go ask Bill Gates for my credentials." At that same moment, Epstein was working with a different part of the bank to try and foster this potentially very lucrative business relationship between the bank and Bill Gates. And so there was this kind of symbiotic moment there where a symbiotic and very complicated moment where one part of JP Morgan is trying to win business with Gates through Epstein. Another part of the bank, the general counsel, is trying to get rid of Epstein because he perceives him as dangerous, but is being told to go check with Bill Gates. And it's not hard to see in that context why. And Epstein was very effective at using his connections and using his name dropping to preserve his reputation and to preserve his credibility with other institutions. And so this was a pretty clear example of this. Now, I will say that the transaction between JP Morgan and Bill Gates never got off the ground. We have no indication that Cutler even called Bill Gates for that reference, or if he had called him, that the reference would have been positive or would have made any difference. So, but it was a pretty vivid example to me of how Epstein was at least trying to flex his muscles with people at the bank, and how, regardless of whether those individual tactics worked, the net result was that Epstein did manage to avoid being kicked out of the bank on numerous occasions over a period of many years, and that accrued directly to his financial benefit.
Well, and also hedge funds were all the rage at that time period. And
Yep.
I believe that there was another connection between
Yep.
Epstein and Highbridge Capital. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so this was around the same time that Epstein introduced Sergey Brin to the bank. Jess Staley and JP Morgan were trying to move into the world of hedge funds, which at the time was like the hot new thing on Wall Street. And Epstein's former girlfriend was a woman named Ava Dubin, who had married a hedge fund manager named Glenn Dubin. And Ava and Jeffrey remained very good personal friends. And in fact, he was the godfather to their daughter. And around 2004, he introduced Glenn Dubin, who ran Highbridge Capital Management, which was this kind of mid-sized, pretty successful hedge fund at the time. Introduced him to the folks at JP Morgan, including Jess Staley, who then negotiated with Epstein's help to buy Highbridge. And that deal became a very important deal for JP Morgan because at least at the time, because it moved the bank into this kind of new exotic world of alternative investing and hedge funds and things like that. It became very important for Epstein, who negotiated a big fee out of this transaction just because he was the middleman. It's kind of a finder's fee. And it really cemented the relationship between Epstein and Staley, because Staley, as a result of having orchestrated this acquisition, it really improved his standing within JP Morgan. And so that was kind of the beginning of Staley's really meteoric rise within the organization. And he owed it in large part to Jeffrey Epstein.
Well, it's remarkable because a lot of this stuff is that time period that leads up to 2008, but it precedes that in your article, which I'm going to circle back to. But I just want to comment that, we're obviously talking about the money side of the equation, which I think is the most, I mean, for people who are indulged in this story, obviously it's the salacious stuff that really drives everything. But this is, obviously a bigger global scenario with all the most powerful people on the planet. And, obviously Epstein comes up, he doesn't have a college degree. He ends up teaching math at the Dalton School. Then he shortly finds himself in a position at Bear Stearns. Again, he doesn't have an MBA, but he finds himself managing some significant capital and on down the line. But it was actually in the 90s, from what your article had revealed, that kind of blew my mind, going back to the former CEO of Chase, who was a financial titan on
Yeah.
Wall Street, which was quite extraordinary, given who he was and who he meets with. And I'm talking about Sandy Warner. And you had
Yep.
mentioned in this article that he had, I believe, met with Epstein in the 90s And could you characterize that?
Yeah, well, I mean, Epstein, just to like get the chronology down for people, like Epstein was teaching at the Dalton School, which is this elite Manhattan school. He was teaching math there in the 80s. One of the kids that was his students was the son, I believe the son of Ace Greenberg, who was the head of Bear Stearns at the time. Ace and Jeffrey hit it off. Ace is very impressed with his math skills and hires Jeffrey to work at Bear Stearns. He works there for a brief period, and the circumstances of his departure from Bear Stearns have never been fully understood, but there was some sort of financial scandal there, like maybe an insider trading case, and that led to his termination. But he maintained very good relationships with the leaders of Bear Stearns, so Greenberg and Jimmy Kane, who went on to be the CEO in particular. And somehow, and again, this is one of the big remaining mysteries to me about Epstein and his chronology. In the early 90s, he's been at this point kicked out of Bear Stearns. He manages to not just kind of salvage his reputation, but also to build a small but successful wealth management operation where he is advising some very rich people. And we do not know exactly who all those people were, even at this point. We know he said to people that he was David Rockefeller, who was, the kind of heir of the Rockefeller fortune, was one of his clients. We do not know that that's actually true, but we know that they were connected. We know he had a relationship where he was advising the heir to the Johnson and Johnson fortune. And most important, we know that he was doing some very substantial financial work for Leslie Wexner, who was the head of Victoria's Secrets and The Limited and was a billionaire who basically allowed Epstein to do whatever he wanted with his money, and much to his later embarrassment. And that's what really got Epstein his kind of on the move financially in the 90s. But by the mid 90s, this guy had kind of emerged as this mystery man on Wall Street, where he would show up at film screenings and fancy parties and things like that, presenting himself as someone who only takes clients who are billionaires. And no one really knew where this lifestyle was coming from and how he was actually making his money. But he was so good and I suspect, and this is not an original thought by me, but I suspect that much of this was a mirage, that he was doing very well managing Wexner's money, but beyond that was not doing a whole hell of a lot. But it nonetheless managed to present himself to the elite of Manhattan as this kind of financial wonder boy who was, doing work for some of the most important people in the world. He would insinuate that he was managing money for the Queen of England, even, and that allowed him to just get a foot in the door in a lot of places he otherwise would not have been able to, including with Sandy Warner, who at the time was the chairman of the bank that would later become JP Morgan. And yeah, as you said, was one of the kind of towering figures of American finance at the time. And Warner, at least in his telling now, nearly 30 years later, claims that he met Epstein at the advice of a friend, and met with him in his office, and then attended a dinner at Jeffrey's house, where while he was sitting at the dinner table, a random woman came by and started like rubbing his shoulders, and that creeped him out, he now says. But he was not so creeped out that he didn't sense a business opportunity, because he then connected this kind of up and coming young banking executive named Jess Staley to Epstein. And as you can probably tell, I'm a little skeptical that Warner was quite as creeped out by Epstein as he now says, because normally when you're creeped out by someone, you do not, you know, turn around and then recommend that your underling meet with that person. But in any case, that was the genesis of this, really, of Staley's close relationship with Epstein. And it's really, to me, it's like a perfect encapsulation of how Epstein worked his magic, because this is a guy he really comes out of nowhere in the 90s, and within the space of several years has transformed himself into a failure who's been chased out of an investment bank, Bear Stearns, that really is not known for being super meticulous about its finances and its behavior. And all of a sudden, he has transformed himself into what everyone believes is this just kind of the right hand man to some of the richest, most powerful people in the world. And I'm not sure that that was true, really, but he was effective enough at presenting that image that it took hold, and it became a little bit, at least, of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right. And your description just kind of brought up, in my mind, Howard Lutnick and what he said last week, by the way. This whole thing is
Yeah.
really weird, beyond the pill, obviously. But again, kind of going back, well, just two more points because we're running out of time here. But could you please talk about the relationship? Like I've been in New York a lot during the 90s, particularly, and everybody understood that there was these, modeling agencies that were
Yeah.
involved with Eastern European women and that sort of thing. And there was a relationship with Jean Brunel, I think is how you pronounce
Yep.
his name.
Jean-Luc Brunel.
Jean-Luc Brunel. Yeah. Could you please characterize that relationship as it relates to the story?
Yeah, I mean it's a little complicated, and the Brunel. So without going too much in the weeds here, and Ghislaine Maxwell, who became Epstein's girlfriend at a point in the 90s, I believe, is the one who made the introduction to Jean-Luc Brunel. Ghislaine was a the daughter of a very famous and rich and scandal-plagued British executive, Robert Maxwell, who died under somewhat mysterious circumstances. She comes to the U.S., somehow very quickly attaches herself to Epstein. And one of the people, and Epstein is obviously introduced or very interested in young women. He and Brunel get connected, and Brunel has been chased out of his modeling agency because of allegations of rape and sexual misconduct. And so he's trying to start his own called MC Squared. And Epstein goes to his new friends at JP Morgan and helps basically, essentially does this financial engineering that allows Brunel to get a loan from a different bank at a much lower interest rate than he otherwise would have, thanks to some help from JP Morgan. And I can explain that in more detail if you care. It's not really, the mechanics of it aren't that important. It's just, and he basically pulls some strings to allow Brunel to get a more favorable loan that will help him start this modeling agency, which goes on to become a very important funnel through which Epstein is getting young women and girls into his network. So a very core part of his sex trafficking operation. And again, I don't want to make it sound like JP Morgan like knew about that in particular or was certainly wasn't their intent, but that it was the effect of what it did in helping him financially with this. And yeah.
Right. And you might just want to, put a fine tooth point on it. What was his fate?
Oh, well, Brunel eventually gets arrested and charged with rape as part of the sex trafficking operation and dies by hanging in a Paris jail cell. So, in other words, and I don't think I need to belabor this, but obviously the same fate that eventually befalls Epstein.
Right.
I don't think that's really, I mean, I don't think it's really a coincidence, but I don't think there's anything super nefarious about that beyond the obvious, which is that they were both running sex trafficking operations and both got caught. And, that the idea of spending a lifetime in prison for an offense like that is probably not super appealing. Or maybe there was something more to it. I mean,
Yeah, the
I don't
relevance is
certainly
that
don't have any evidence that there was more to it, but there were obviously a lot of powerful people uh, whose secrets were being harbored by people like Epstein. And I'm sure there were a lot of those people who were like happy that he died
right,
and
but
a little relieved they died. But I don't want to like suggest that they somehow like orchestrated these deaths
no.
because there's not any evidence that that's true.
Yeah, nor are we. It just
Yeah, no, I
that's
know you're
just
not.
part of the
I know you're
yeah,
not.
yeah, that's just part of the story. But the fact is that they were doing business at J.P. Morgan Chase, as was
Yep.
who else? Because Elaine Maxwell. Okay, just a quick comment on that.
Yeah, and Maxwell, and thanks in large part to Epstein, set her up with accounts as well at JP Morgan. And Epstein set up accounts at JP Morgan. There were scores of them covering all sorts of things. And among other things, I mentioned earlier that some of Epstein's victims ended up getting bank accounts through which Epstein could pay them and provide and enable them to go recruit other women and girls. But Maxwell, in particular, he had set up accounts for. So because Maxwell at various points was Epstein's girlfriend, or I think more important, was essentially running his operations, and that's what she's been convicted of. And we've seen documentation where she literally, like, Epstein has this or had this mansion in Manhattan. There was this 7-story, just very complicated operation to run there, and Maxwell was doing everything from like inviting people over to like redecorating, and she had her own office there. She was procuring, and then she would go down to the Jeffrey's Island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and like money to buy the helicopter that was going to take people to and from that island came through JP Morgan from Epstein's account to Ghislaine Maxwell's account. And there's all sorts of financing of the island that was going on through JP Morgan and through Ghislaine Maxwell. And all the only thing I'll say in fairness to JP Morgan is that like I don't think in their wildest imagination they could reasonably have understood the depths and depravity of what Epstein was doing on the island or elsewhere. They did finance large portions of that. It was I think they got a little bit unlucky in that regard. But the truth is that there were a zillion warning signs, and they knew that something fishy was going on, and they knew that this was a man capable of doing very bad things. He'd been convicted and admitted to doing very bad things, and yet they continued to do huge quantities of business with him for many years afterwards.
I think one of the most shocking quotes of the entire shocking revelations of all of these things, just because of the details, and many of us could, consider those were the types of things happening, but to look under the hood, to see the relationships documented in our nation's paper of record, thanks to you and your just incredible colleagues that were able to pull this together. So thank you for doing that. But, I just want to quote this from the article itself. It said, in private, Staley and Erdos seemed to make light of their clients' predilections. That August, Staley attended a Hamptons fundraiser and was struck by the crowd's composition. Quote, the ages between husband and wives would have fit in well with Jeffrey, he told Erdos in an email. She replied that Epstein's name had come up at an event the night before. An acquaintance noted how another prominent New York businessman liked to surround himself with beautiful assistants. Lots of comparisons, quote, lots of comparisons to Jeffrey Epstein, she wrote, Erdros wrote, adding that people were laughing about Jeffrey. It seems like the culture, I don't want to call it eyes wide shut, but I'm going to call it eyes wide shut. I'm just curious if you could, from writing this and seeing this and being a part of, the deepest levels of New York for as long as you have, can you kind
Yeah.
of qualify that?
I mean, I don't know what more there is to say, really. I mean, it's very clear. Epstein, look, once you're part of that society and part of that world, I think it's maybe hard to get kicked out of it, really. And you'd have to do something really that would offend everyone and be unfamiliar to everyone to lose access to that world. And soliciting prostitution from a minor clearly wasn't it. And it was an open secret in these circles that Epstein had a predilection for very young women and perhaps girls. And that was just seen as his idiosyncrasy, really. He was a very idiosyncratic guy, and this was seen as part of that. And I think it required some willful blindness by the people who were kind of convincing themselves that despite these peccadillos, he Epstein was still worth doing business with. And I mean, I think what to me is more startling than the revelation that bank executives were kind of joking about Epstein after he was criminally charged in Florida in 2006. It's more what happens afterwards when he enters a guilty plea. He serves a year in jail, give or take, and then another year of house arrest. And then he reemerges on the Manhattan scene and the Hampton scene as if nothing had happened. And there was a New York Post article that my colleagues and I were just looking at from like 2011 or so, I think, where there was a film screening of I think Money Never Sleeps in the Hamptons. And Epstein, there's like a whole gathering for the premiere at someone's mansion out there of like the great and good of Manhattan society. And including these some of the most elite people on Wall Street and the corporate world. And there's Jeffrey Epstein mingling and laughing and just going on as if nothing had happened and everything was normal. And, you know, I don't know, man. In the circles I roll in, if you go to jail for a while, like for something like this, and there are a lot of rumors about you, most normal people are like, I don't want anything to do with this guy. This is like, I don't know what he's been convicted of and where the truth is, but this guy gives me an icky feeling, and that's not the kind of person I want to hang out with. And that is just like the opposite of what happened here. And people were very, very willing to forgive and forget. And I don't think we fully understand quite why for all of these people. We do for some of these people. And I think, and one of the big projects my colleagues and I continue to work on is to, without going into details, is to understand how a lot of these people who continued to circle around Epstein in these years after he went to jail, what they knew and how they got comfortable with this and why they got comfortable with this. What did they have to gain by continuing to operate in Epstein's circles? And so, I mean, that's a question that I hope we will have more answers to going forward.
Money, power, influence, leverage.
Sex. Don't forget sex because that's part of this too. It
Yeah,
is.
no, the
It
sex.
is.
Yeah, no kidding, man. That is so true. Just by contrast, and again, we don't have enough time to go into it, but in terms of kind of like the standards, like you talked about, Wesley Snipes was dropped. I mean, he was a very well-known
Yep.
and still well-known Hollywood celebrity, but from the bank for much lesser scenarios, right? But
Yeah, I
I
mean,
mean,
he
just
was
to qualify.
accused. He was charged with tax fraud by federal prosecutors around, like, I think it was a couple weeks after Epstein had been charged in Florida initially, and there was, and we've seen the records that support this inside the bank, and there was two discussions. There were discussions about each of them about what to do with these men as clients now that they faced allegations of wrongdoing, and with Wesley Snipes, the decision was quickly made that because he had been accused, he had not been convicted, he had not entered a plea, but because he had been accused by prosecutors of tax fraud, he needed to be kicked out of the bank, and he was kicked out of the bank very swiftly. With Epstein, who had been accused of, sex crimes, or one sex crime at least, and was suspected of many more sex crimes, the decision was the opposite, which is that despite there was a large contingent within the bank that was pushing to get rid of him, but the decision was made from on high, including by Jess Staley, possibly by others as well, that despite those allegations, he was worth maintaining as a client. And, that was a very fateful and telling decision, I think.
Yeah, and I think way downstream, you guys mentioned that he was actually proffering counsel to Staley even when I believe he was in
Yeah,
jail,
that's true.
and he had inside information, which is very unnerving. But that's obviously there's more to talk about. Just to kind of close this up, a couple of interesting things. Obviously, now eventually Epstein is dropped from JP Morgan, and he winds up going to none other than Deutsche Bank, which of
Yeah,
course
it's,
you know
the
about Deutsche Bank.
circle is complete for me, at least. My
Ex-
two of my favorite topics, Deutsche Bank and
Right.
Jeffrey Epstein.
Well, and then there's other aspects of that, but I have been really engaged in, I don't know, my obviously my curiosity tickled by the idea of what Epstein did with Bear Stearns by way of liquid capital. And, to bring this whole thing full circle, I'm just going to say very briefly, because this is a whole nother conversation, because of the time period of 2008. We ultimately have really all the powers that be from the federal government, the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, and so forth, meeting, of course, with Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan, I mean, all of the banks to purchase, the assets on a fire sale with
Yep.
Bear Stearns, which then through Maiden Lane, there's some very interesting things that take shape. Look, which is just as important as everything else. The final thing I want to get you to address, just given because the political, I mean, look, the country's blowing up right now. We've got troops in the street in Chicago and dancing frogs in Oregon. And everything that is. But our country's melting down before our eyes. Next week we have the No Kings rally, right on the verge of what could be martial law, and Stephen Miller and some very strange things, and someone talking to his ear. I'm just kind of being all over the map, but at the same time, you have this situation here with Epstein where everybody is barking Epstein, Epstein, Epstein. Do the Epstein files. This is all over social media in every direction, and now we've got Ro Khanna and Thomas Massey formally writing a letter engaging Jamie Dimon. I always want to say JP Morgan Chase when I'm talking about Jamie Dimon. It's interesting how that correlates in my mind, but asking very direct questions about why it was even possible for all of this stuff to take place. You want to give us some closing comments? Because hopefully, let's hope they're watching this actually.
Well, I mean, I just think this is a it kind of brings us full circle because at the top we were talking about how a lot of the stuff about JP Morgan has it's been written in individual pieces before. But to me, this is kind of the value of pulling everything together, which is that it leads people in Congress, among many other places, to kind of sit up and they can read this and say, "Oh, I'm like fully understanding why this matters and why this sum of the parts is maybe, or why the whole is a little more than sum of the parts." And I mean, I think that's why we wrote this story, is so that people would have that full picture. And we wrote it knowing that there were a bunch of questions that we do not have the information to answer yet. And one of those is what JP Morgan, or I'm sorry, I just did the same thing you did. What Jamie Dimon knew and when he knew it. And I think, and what Jamie has said is that he said this under oath, as implausible as it might sound. He said that he was not aware of Epstein at all in any circumstance, and certainly not that he was a client of the bank until after Epstein died, or at least after Epstein was arrested in 2019. And uh, you know, we get into this in the story. That is very hard for me to believe. I'm not saying it's not true, and we do not have evidence that it's not true. What we do have evidence of is that people inside JP Morgan were like in writing referring to the fact that Jamie was, or at least implying in writing that Jamie was in the loop and knew some about this. And we have Jess Staley under oath, under penalty of perjury, saying that he it looped Jamie Dimon in. And so either Staley is lying or Dimon is lying. I don't, or maybe they're both lying. I don't know. I don't see a way that both of them are telling the truth, though, given their kind of diametrically opposed viewpoints. And if Dimon is the one who is lying, and he did have knowledge about this, and congressional investigators with their subpoena power can get to the bottom of it, I mean, that is a huge story. That is, and I mean, one of the things I think is so interesting about the Epstein story right now in our political environment is that the Epstein story has been kept alive in part. I mean, there's like journalists have been doing it, victims have been doing it, advocacy groups have been doing it, but you know who else has been doing it? Like a large part of MAGA world has been doing it and crying for answers and claiming that the reason more answers haven't come out is that there is a vast conspiracy where some of the richest, most powerful, most kind of democratic, capital D democratic people in the world are part of a conspiracy to keep this stuff shut up. And if it turns out that Jamie Dimon knew about this stuff years earlier and has been lying about it since, that is going to be the latest example. And there are many other examples of this already as well, where the people on the MAGA right, who are obviously like traffic and lies and disinformation a lot, are actually right on this one. Like that there has been a real conspiracy to keep this stuff shut up. And the conspiracy has been perpetrated in part by people on the left. And it's, again, I'm not suggesting at all that Jamie Dimon is a pedophile or knows about pedophilia or anything like this, but this is a kind of long-term loyal Democrat running the bank that was financing Epstein and claiming very conveniently that he himself had no knowledge of this until years later. And we write this in the article, but and that either he's lying, which is not good, or he was really removed from the day-to-day operations of what was going on at the bank. And this is something his high-ranking executives were fighting about over a long period. And so if he was in the dark about that, and that does not speak very well of his managerial prowess, I would say, especially for someone like Dimon, who has just consistently prided himself on and boasted about how his attention to detail and how he like gets involved in the weeds of things. And so this would be a rare exception to that, a very convenient rare exception to that. So we'll see. And that is one of the things that this letter from Congress, if it ever gets acted on and subpoenas are ever issued or Dimon ever agrees under some sort of penalty to come testify before Congress, that I'm sure he'll be asked about. And it's possible he's just going to stick to what he said previously, but it's also possible that more information will emerge. And I personally look forward to as much information as possible emerging as soon as possible.
Well, this has been one of the most satisfying dialogues I've ever had. And
Um,
people, please know that you've got to read this, and I'll put a link in the description below. But David Enrich's article alongside his colleagues, How JP Morgan Enabled the Crimes of Jeffrey Epstein. And of course, that was co written by Matthew Goldstein and Jessica Silver Greenberg. Congratulations on the spectacular work. I'd probably like to just say in closing that. Well, there's just when you have Marjorie Taylor Greene react the way that you just described, right? The compunction is there. The right question is being asked. Why would there be a separate standard of laws for those above the law? I mean, that with wealth and power and privilege that aren't held to the same standards, the rest of the country is. I mean, that's the most important question to be asking now. And then, of course, what Edwards, the attorney for the Epstein victims, had
Yep.
postulated, on the steps of the Capitol several weeks ago when he said to the media, "You're looking in the wrong place. You have to look at the FinCEN files, the suspicious activity reports," which, of course, brought it right back to
Yep.
you and your colleagues' spectacular work. Look, I look forward to more. Thank you for all you do. And also, please, everyone, if you want a full scope of this incredible information, don't hesitate. Go now and get Dark Towers, David's first book on, of course, Deutsche Bank and the relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Not to mention, I thought it was just as amazing, of course. Not Wicked, sorry, the second book, Servants of the Damned, of course,
Yep.
to understand tall building capitulation. And then, of course, one of the most important revelations, I think, in the midst of this battle, really to destroy free speech right now by this administration, of course, Murder of the Truth, all incredible pieces of literature that you have to get your head around. Thank you, David Enrich, for your time as always, and I'll look forward to seeing
Thank
your
you.
work in the future. And all the best. Take care. Have a
Thanks,
great
Patrick.
Sunday. Take care. Bye.